The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy downtown streets as Sarah Bennett walked confidently toward her favorite cafe, Morningstar Coffee House. At 34 years old, she had developed a comfortable routine over the past 3 years, stopping at the same cafe every morning before heading to her office at Parker and Associates, where she worked as a senior marketing executive. Sarah's dark brown hair was neatly styled, and her navy blue business suit spoke of success and professionalism. She had worked hard to reach her position, breaking through barriers as one of the few black women in senior management at her firm. The golden name tag on her designer handbag read S. Bennett, a graduation gift she had received from her parents when she completed her MBA. The familiar smell of freshly ground coffee beans welcomed her as she pushed open the heavy glass door of Morningstar. The usual morning crowd was there, students hunched over laptops, business people checking their phones, and the regular elderly couple who always sat by the window sharing a chocolate croissant. What wasn't familiar was the new security guard standing near the entrance. Thomas Miller had started his job just 2 days ago, though Sarah didn't know this yet. He stood with his arms crossed, his security uniform pressed and crisp, watching the customers with unusual intensity. Something about his presence made several patrons uncomfortable, but they couldn't quite put their finger on why. As Sarah walked toward the counter, she smiled at Maria, the barista who had been serving her morning coffee for years. "Good morning," Sarah called out, already reaching for her wallet. Maria smiled back and started preparing Sarah's usual order, a large caramel latte with an extra shot of espresso. "The usual breakfast sandwich too, Sarah?" Maria asked, her hands moving efficiently among the coffee machines. "Yes, please," Sarah replied, pulling out her credit card. "It's going to be a long day of meetings, and I'll need the energy." Just then, Thomas Miller stepped away from his post by the door. His eyes had been following Sarah since she entered, and something in his expression had changed. He moved with deliberate steps toward the counter, his hand resting on his belt in what he probably thought was an authoritative pose. Other customers began to notice his movement. A young Asian student looked up from his textbook, his forehead creasing with concern. An elderly white woman paused with her coffee cup halfway to her lips, watching the scene unfold. The cafe's usual morning chatter began to die down as Miller approached Sarah. The security guard's face had hardened into what could only be described as a scowl. Sarah, still waiting for her order, was checking her phone messages and hadn't noticed him yet. "Excuse me, ma'am," Miller said, his voice carrying an edge that made several nearby customers flinch. "I need to see what's in your bag." Sarah looked up, surprised. She glanced around, certain he must be speaking to someone else. But Miller's eyes were fixed directly on her, his stance aggressive and confrontational. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice calm but confused. "Is there a problem?" "You heard me," Miller responded, taking another step closer. "We've had some theft issues lately, and I need to check your bag." Maria, who had been preparing Sarah's coffee, stopped what she was doing. Her face showed a mix of shock and disbelief. "Sir, this is Ms. Bennett. She's been coming here every morning for years. There must be some mistake." Miller ignored Maria completely, his attention focused solely on Sarah. "Open the bag," he demanded, his voice growing louder. Now, the cafe had gone completely silent. Every customer was watching now, their breakfasts and conversations forgotten. Sarah stood straight, her professional demeanor intact despite the growing tension. "I will not open my bag," she said firmly. "I'm a regular customer here, and I don't appreciate being singled out and harassed." Miller's face reddened at her refusal. His hand moved from his belt to gesture at her bag more aggressively. "Either you open that fancy bag right now, or things are going to get very unpleasant." Sarah felt her heart racing, but years of dealing with workplace discrimination had taught her to maintain her composure. She looked around the cafe, noting the shocked faces of other customers, some of whom had already taken out their phones. Little did anyone know that this ordinary morning was about to spiral into an incident that would shock the community and spark a nationwide conversation about racial profiling and security protocols in private businesses. The next few minutes would change not only Sarah's life, but the lives of everyone present in Morningstar Coffee House that morning. The tension in Morningstar Coffee House could be cut with a knife. Thomas Miller, the security guard, took another aggressive step toward Sarah Bennett, his face twisted with unmistakable prejudice. The other customers watched in horror as the situation escalated rapidly. "Last warning," Miller growled, reaching for Sarah's designer handbag. "Show me what you're hiding in there." Sarah took a step back, clutching her bag closer. "Do not touch me or my belongings," she said firmly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I've been coming here for years. I demand to speak to your supervisor." Miller's response was immediate and shocking. He lunged forward, grabbing Sarah's bag with one hand and her arm with the other. "You people always think you're above the rules," he spat out, his words dripping with racial hatred. Maria, the barista, rushed from behind the counter. "Stop this right now. I'm calling the manager." She pulled out her phone with shaking hands, but Miller seemed beyond caring about consequences. In the violent struggle that followed, Miller not only tried to wrench the bag from Sarah's grasp, but also began pulling at her jacket. "If you won't show me what you're hiding, I'll find it myself," he shouted, his actions becoming more aggressive by the second. The elderly couple by the window stood up in alarm. The husband, Mr. Thompson, a retired judge, called out, "Young man, you're assaulting this woman. Stop immediately." Several younger customers had their phones out, recording the incident. A college student named Jenny Chen was already live streaming the whole thing, her hands trembling as she captured the horrifying scene. "Someone call the police," shouted a businessman from the corner, already dialing 911 himself. Sarah struggled to maintain her dignity as Miller continued his assault. Her carefully styled hair was now disheveled, and her jacket had been partially torn. Yet she stood her ground, refusing to let this man humiliate her further. "You have no right to do this," Sarah declared, her voice rising above the chaos. "This is assault and racial profiling, and you're being recorded from multiple angles." The mention of recording seemed to penetrate Miller's rage-filled haze for a moment. He glanced around, finally noticing the forest of phones pointed in his direction, but instead of backing down, his face contorted with even more anger. "You're just trying to cause trouble," he snarled, his grip on Sarah's arm tightening. "Always playing the victim, aren't you?" At that moment, an unexpected hero emerged from the crowd. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman who had been quietly enjoying her morning coffee just minutes ago, stepped forward with surprising speed. Despite her age, she positioned herself between Sarah and Miller. "Take your hands off her this instant," Mrs. Thompson commanded, her voice carrying the authority of her 80 years. "I've seen enough discrimination in my lifetime, young man, and I won't stand for it today." Other customers began to move closer, forming a protective circle around Sarah. The young Asian student who had been studying stepped up beside Mrs. Thompson, his expression determined. A group of business people moved in as well, their phones still recording. Miller found himself increasingly isolated as more customers joined the group defending Sarah. His grip on her arm loosened slightly, but his face showed no sign of backing down. Just then, the cafe's door burst open. Lisa Chen, the owner of Morningstar Coffee House, rushed in, having received multiple urgent calls from her staff. Her face paled as she took in the scene before her. "What in God's name is going on here?" Lisa demanded, her usually calm demeanor replaced by shock and anger. Miller turned to Lisa, attempting to justify his actions. "This woman," he began, but Lisa cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Release her immediately," Lisa ordered, her voice leaving no room for argument. "You're fired. Get out of my cafe right now before I have you arrested." The security guard's face went through a range of emotions: shock, anger, and finally, as he looked around at the dozens of phones recording his every move, a flicker of fear. He released Sarah's arm and stepped back, finally seeming to realize the gravity of his actions. But the damage was done. Sarah's jacket was torn, her arm was bruised, and her dignity had been assaulted in front of a cafe full of witnesses. As Miller backed away, the full impact of what had just happened began to sink in for everyone present. This wasn't just a simple case of security guard overreach. This was a clear case of racial profiling and assault that would soon spark a much larger conversation in their community. As Thomas Miller finally backed away from Sarah Bennett, the cafe erupted into a flurry of activity. Lisa Chen, the owner, immediately rushed to Sarah's side, her face filled with genuine concern and horror at what had just transpired in her establishment. "Sarah, I am so sorry," Lisa said, gently guiding her to a nearby chair. "Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" Her hands trembled as she examined the bruises forming on Sarah's arm where Miller had grabbed her. Sarah sat down slowly, her professional composure finally cracking as the adrenaline began to wear off. Her torn jacket hung loosely from her shoulders, and her carefully arranged hair had come undone during the struggle. Despite her disheveled appearance, she maintained a dignity that impressed everyone present. Maria, the barista, appeared with a glass of water and a cold compress for Sarah's arm. "The police are on their way," she said softly, tears in her eyes. "We have so many videos of what happened. You won't get away with this." The elderly Mrs. Thompson remained close by, her hand resting protectively on Sarah's shoulder. "I've already called my daughter," she said. "She's one of the best civil rights attorneys in the city. She'll be here in 15 minutes. Meanwhile, Miller stood near the door, his face a mix of defiance and growing fear as he realized the severity of his actions. Several male customers had positioned themselves between him and the exit, ensuring he wouldn't leave before the police arrived. Jenny Chen, the student who had been live streaming the incident, approached Sarah cautiously. "Miss Bennett, your story is already going viral. There are thousands of people watching right now, and they're all supporting you. Would you like me to stop the stream?" Sarah took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders. "No," she said firmly. "Let them see. This needs to be seen. This has to stop happening to people who look like me." The cafe had become a hub of activity. Some customers were giving statements to each other, ensuring their stories matched for when the police arrived. Others were comparing video footage, making sure they had captured every angle of the incident. The elderly Mr. Thompson, the retired judge, was quietly advising Lisa about the legal implications of what had just occurred in her business. Outside, a small crowd had begun to gather. Word had spread quickly through social media, and local news vans were already pulling up to the curb. Through the windows, Sarah could see reporters setting up their cameras, preparing to cover the story. Lisa sat down across from Sarah, her face etched with worry. "Sarah, I want you to know that Miller was hired through a security company. He'd only been here for 2 days. We had no idea." Her voice trailed off as tears formed in her eyes. "It's not your fault, Lisa," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her ordeal. "But we need to talk about how to prevent this from happening again." The sound of sirens filled the air as 2 police cars pulled up outside the cafe. 4 officers entered, taking in the scene before them. The lead officer, a woman named Rodriguez, approached Sarah while her colleagues moved toward Miller. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said gently, "I understand you've been assaulted. Can you tell me what happened?" Before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Thompson's daughter, Angela Thompson Brooks, burst through the door. The well-known civil rights attorney quickly assessed the situation and moved to Sarah's side. "I'm Sarah Bennett's legal representation," she announced firmly. "Before my client makes any statements, I need to ensure her rights are protected." Officer Rodriguez nodded respectfully, recognizing the attorney. "Of course, counselor. We also need to document Ms. Bennett's injuries and collect statements from witnesses." As the police began their work, Sarah looked around the cafe at all the faces watching her with concern and support. She saw people of all races and ages united in their outrage at what had happened to her. In that moment, despite her torn clothes and bruised arm, she felt a strange sense of purpose. "Angela," she said to her newly acquired attorney, "I want to make sure this incident leads to real change. Not just here, but everywhere." Angela nodded, understanding the weight of Sarah's words. "We'll make sure it does," she promised, already planning their next steps. "This isn't just about one security guard or one cafe. This is about systemic change." As the morning continued to unfold, none of those present could have predicted how this incident would indeed become a catalyst for major changes in their community and beyond. The next few hours would prove crucial in determining just how far-reaching the impact of this morning's events would become. Within an hour, Morningstar Coffee House had transformed from a quiet cafe into the epicenter of a growing movement. Outside, the crowd had swelled to over 100 people, many holding hastily made signs condemning racism and supporting Sarah Bennett. Local news crews jostled for position while reporters delivered live updates to their stations. Inside, Sarah sat with her attorney, Angela Thompson Brooks, as they reviewed the numerous videos captured by customers. Crystal clear detail: Miller's unprovoked aggression, his racist comments, and the physical assault that followed. "The evidence is overwhelming," Angela said, her expression grim but determined. "We're not just looking at assault charges. This is a clear hate crime with multiple witnesses and video evidence." Officer Rodriguez returned to their table with her notepad. "Ms. Bennett, we've arrested Mr. Miller. He's being charged with assault, battery, and we're adding hate crime enhancements to the charges. Would you like to press additional charges?" "Yes," Sarah replied firmly. "All of them, and I want to know how he was hired in the first place." She turned to Lisa Chen, who had been providing statements to another officer. "Lisa, which security company hired him?" Lisa quickly retrieved the contract paperwork. "Elite Guard Services," she read, her hands shaking slightly. They promised thoroughly vetted guards. They said all their employees underwent background checks and anti-bias training. Angela's eyes narrowed as she wrote down the company name. "We'll be looking into them as well. A company that puts armed security guards in public spaces has a responsibility to ensure they're not hiring individuals with discriminatory tendencies." Meanwhile, Jenny Chen's livestream had gone viral, reaching over 1 million views. Comments of support flooded in from around the country, along with stories from others who had faced similar discrimination. The incident was quickly becoming a rallying point for discussions about racial profiling in private businesses. Mrs. Thompson, who had refused to leave Sarah's side, shared her own perspective with a local reporter. "I've seen discrimination change its face over the decades, but it's still here. What happened today shows we still have so much work to do." By noon, several civil rights organizations had reached out to Sarah's attorney. The local chapter of the NAACP sent representatives to the Caffe, and community leaders began arriving to show their support. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with messages from her colleagues at Parker and Associates. Her boss had already issued a statement of support and given her as much time as she needed to handle the situation. But Sarah knew she needed to do more than just handle it. She needed to create change. "Angela," she said, turning to her attorney, "I want to file a civil suit against both Elite Guard Services and Miller personally. But I don't want just monetary damages. I want systemic changes in how security companies hire and train their personnel." Angela nodded approvingly. "We can demand mandatory anti-bias training, regular psychological evaluations, and transparent hiring practices. We can make this case about prevention, not just punishment." Lisa Chen, who had been listening nearby, stepped forward. "I want to help," she said firmly. "I'm willing to be a test case for new security protocols. We can develop better standards right here, show other businesses how it should be done." Outside, the crowd had begun chanting Sarah's name, turning her personal ordeal into a symbol of resistance against discrimination. Local community organizers were already planning a larger rally for the weekend. Sarah stood up carefully, her bruised arms still tender. She walked to the cafe's window and looked out at the gathering crowd. She saw people of all backgrounds standing together, united in their demand for justice and change. "You know," she said softly to those nearby, "when I walked in here this morning, I was just thinking about my coffee and my meetings. Now," she paused, watching as more people joined the crowd outside, "now I'm thinking about how to turn this moment into a movement." Angela placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. "That's exactly what we're going to do. This isn't going to be just another incident that gets forgotten after a news cycle. We're going to make sure real changes come from this." As the afternoon approached, Sarah's story had reached national news networks. What had started as a horrifying incident of racial profiling was rapidly evolving into something larger, a catalyst for change in how businesses handled security, how companies vetted their employees, and how communities responded to racial discrimination. The day was far from over, and Sarah Bennett's fight for justice was just beginning. But looking at the support gathering around her, both in the cafe and outside, she knew she wasn't fighting alone. By evening, Morningstar Coffee House had become the heart of a rapidly growing movement. Sarah Bennett's story had spread across social media platforms, news channels, and community networks. The hashtag Justice for Sarah was trending nationwide, and the video of the incident had been viewed millions of times. Sarah sat in a makeshift command center that had been set up in the cafe's back office. Her attorney, Angela Thompson Brooks, had brought in a team of legal assistants who were sorting through hundreds of messages and offers of support. Most surprisingly, Other victims of elite guard services had started coming forward. We've received 15 similar complaints about elite guard services in the past 2 hours, Angela announced, reviewing the documents spread across the table. Their guards have been involved in racial profiling incidents across 3 states. This is a pattern, not an isolated incident. Lisa Chen, who had closed the cafe to regular business but kept it open as a meeting space, brought fresh coffee to the team. The security company's regional manager called, she said, her face showing disgust. They tried to offer me a different guard and a discount on services. Sarah looked up from her phone, where she'd been reading messages of support. What did you tell them? I told them they'd lost my business forever, Lisa replied firmly. And I've already contacted other cafe owners in the area. None of us will be using their services again. Outside, the crowd had grown even larger. Community organizers had set up a stage, and speakers were sharing their own experiences with racial profiling. Local musicians had started performing, turning the gathering into a peaceful protest concert. Jenny Chen, whose live stream had helped the story go viral, was now working with local activists to coordinate social media coverage. The response is incredible, she reported to Sarah. People are organizing solidarity events in 12 different cities for tomorrow. Sarah's phone rang. It was her boss again. Sarah, he said when she answered, the board wants to meet with you tomorrow. They're considering pulling our company's contracts with elite guard services nationwide. Would you be willing to share your story with them? Of course, Sarah replied, a sense of purpose growing stronger within her. This is bigger than just what happened to me. It's about changing how these companies operate. As night fell, Angela gathered everyone for an update. The legal team had discovered that elite guard services had a history of hiring guards with problematic backgrounds. Thomas Miller, it turned out, had been fired from 2 previous security jobs for similar incidents, but the company had failed to conduct proper background checks. We're building a strong case, Angela explained. Not just against Miller, but against the entire company. Their negligent hiring practices put people at risk, and they knew it. Mrs. Thompson, who had stayed to help despite her age, shared some encouraging news. My friends at the City Council are calling for an emergency meeting. They want to discuss new regulations for security companies operating within city limits. Lisa, who had been on the phone with other business owners, added her own update. The Downtown Business Association is drafting new guidelines for hiring security services. They want Sarah to consult on the project. Sarah looked around the room at all the people working to turn her traumatic experience into positive change. The bruises on her arm were still visible, but they had become symbols of resistance rather than just marks of victimization. I never expected this, she said quietly. When it was happening, I felt so alone. But look at all of you, look at everyone outside. We're not alone anymore. Angela squeezed her shoulder supportively. This is how change happens. One incident becomes a catalyst, and people unite to say enough is enough. As midnight approached, the crowd outside had thinned but remained significant. News crews were still broadcasting live updates, and social media continued to buzz with activity. The story had struck a chord that resonated far beyond their city. Sarah stood at the window, watching the peaceful protesters who had stayed despite the late hour. The candles created a warm glow in the darkness, a literal and metaphorical light shining on an issue that had been in the shadows for too long. Tomorrow, she said to her team, we start pushing for real changes. No more empty promises from security companies. No more looking the other way when these incidents happen. We're going to set new standards. As part 5 of this unfolding story came to a close, it was clear that Sarah Bennett's morning coffee run had sparked something much larger, a movement that would challenge and change how businesses approached security, hiring practices, and racial bias in their communities. 1 week after the incident at Morningstar Coffee House, Sarah Bennett stood on the courthouse steps beside her attorney, Angela Thompson Brooks. They had just filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit against both Thomas Miller and Elite Guard Services, marking the beginning of what promised to be a landmark case. The lawsuit seeks not only compensatory damages, Angela announced to the gathered press, but also demands fundamental changes in how security companies operate. We're asking for mandatory bias training, thorough background checks, and regular psychological evaluations for all security personnel. Sarah stepped up to the microphone, her voice steady and determined. This case isn't about money. It's about making sure what happened to me never happens to anyone else. No one should feel threatened or humiliated while going about their daily life. Inside the courthouse, the legal team had submitted evidence that would shock the community. Their investigation had uncovered dozens of complaints against elite guard services that had been quietly settled and buried. Thomas Miller's personnel file revealed a disturbing pattern of aggressive behavior that the company had ignored. "Look at this," Angela said, showing Sarah a stack of documents in their private meeting room. Miller was fired from 3 previous security jobs for excessive force, but elite guard services never bothered to check his references. They just handed him a uniform and a badge. The district attorney's office had also taken notice. Back at Morningstar Coffee House, Lisa Chen had transformed her business into a model of inclusive security practices. She hired a new security company that specialized in de-escalation techniques and community-based protection. Every guard underwent extensive training in cultural sensitivity and bias awareness. "We're setting a new standard," Lisa had explained to a Business Journal reporter. "Other cafe owners are already adopting our protocols. It's creating a ripple effect across the industry." Sarah's employer, Parker and Associates, had taken decisive action as well. The company terminated all contracts with elite guard services and implemented new vendor screening procedures that emphasized diversity, equity, and inclusion. The movement continued to grow. Jenny Chen's viral video had sparked similar investigations in other cities, revealing a nationwide pattern of discriminatory security practices. Civil rights organizations were using Sarah's case as a rallying point for broader reform. Ms. Bennett called out a reporter as Sarah left the courthouse. "How do you feel about becoming the face of this movement?" Sarah paused thoughtfully before responding. "I never chose this role, but I accept it. Sometimes leadership finds you in moments of crisis. What matters is what you do with that responsibility." Later that afternoon, Sarah met with a group of security industry executives who were eager to get ahead of the coming changes. They wanted her input on developing new training programs and hiring guidelines. "We need to rebuild trust with the communities we serve," one CEO admitted. "Your case has shown us how badly we failed in that responsibility." Angela, who attended the meeting as Sarah's counsel, was direct in her demands. "We need more than promises. We need binding commitments, regular audits, and transparent reporting of incidents. The old way of doing business is over." The lawsuit had also attracted the attention of state legislators. A new bill, already being called the Bennett Act, was introduced to establish statewide standards for security guard licensing and training. As evening approached, Sarah returned to Morningstar Coffee House for a community meeting. The cafe had become a symbol of positive change, hosting regular discussions about security reform and racial justice. "When I look around this room," Sarah addressed the gathered crowd, "I see what's possible when people come together to demand better. We're not just filing lawsuits and changing policies, we're changing hearts and minds." Mrs. Thompson, still a regular presence at these meetings, nodded in agreement. "In my lifetime, I've seen many movements for change. This one has something special. It's bringing together business owners, community members, and security professionals. Everyone realizes we need to do better." The legal battle was just beginning, but its impact was already being felt across the country. Sarah's case had become a catalyst for examining how private security operated in public spaces and how businesses could better serve diverse communities. As night fell over the city, Sarah sat in her familiar spot by the cafe window, sipping the same caramel latte she'd ordered on that fateful morning. But now, instead of facing discrimination and violence, she was surrounded by allies and advocates, all working together to turn a moment of injustice into a movement for lasting change. 3 months after the incident, the legal proceedings against Thomas Miller and Elite Guard Services reached a critical turning point. The courthouse was packed as Miller's criminal trial began, with Sarah Bennett sitting in the front row, surrounded by supporters. The evidence presented was overwhelming. Video footage from multiple angles played on the courtroom screens, showing Miller's unprovoked assault in vivid detail. One by one, witnesses from the cafe took the stand, recounting what they had seen that morning. Mrs. Thompson's testimony proved particularly powerful. "I've seen discrimination wear many faces over my 80 years, she told the jury, her voice clear and strong. "What I witnessed that day was pure hatred, nothing less." The defense tried to portray Miller's actions as standard security protocol, but cross-examination revealed his history of similar incidents. Former colleagues testified about his racist comments and aggressive behavior at previous jobs. The defendant showed a clear pattern of targeting people of color, the prosecutor argued in her closing statement. This wasn't about security, it was about prejudice and power. After just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts. Miller faced 8 years in prison, with no possibility of early release due to the hate crime enhancements. But the criminal verdict was just the beginning. The civil case against Elite Guard Services was making even bigger waves in the security industry. Rather than risk a public trial, the company agreed to a groundbreaking settlement. This isn't just about monetary damages, Angela explained to reporters outside the courthouse. The settlement includes mandatory. The terms were unprecedented. Elite Guard Services would pay substantial damages, but more importantly, they agreed to implement comprehensive background checks for all employees, require quarterly anti-bias training and psychological evaluations, create an independent oversight board with community representatives, establish a public reporting system for security incidents, fund a scholarship program for minority students entering law enforcement. The changes spread beyond one company. Other security firms, seeing the writing on the wall, began voluntarily adopting similar reforms. The Bennett standards, as they became known, were becoming industry practice. Sarah's influence continued to grow. She was invited to speak at security industry conferences, police academies, and business schools. Her story became a case study in how to transform a personal injury into systemic change. We're not just changing policies, she told a gathering of business leaders. We're changing the culture of security itself. Protection shouldn't come at the cost of dignity. Morningstar Coffee House had become a model business, hosting training sessions for other establishments on inclusive security practices. Lisa Chen's new protocols were being adopted by cafes and restaurants across the country. Jenny Chen, whose live stream had helped spark the movement, produced a documentary about the case. From Coffee to Change, premiered at a local film festival, winning awards and bringing the story to an even wider audience. The state legislature passed the Bennett Act with broad bipartisan support. The law established strict standards for security guard licensing, requiring extensive training in de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and proper use of force. One afternoon, as Sarah sat in her usual spot at Morningstar, she noticed something different. The new security guard, a young woman named Maya, was chatting warmly with customers while maintaining professional awareness of her surroundings. There was no fear, no tension, just mutual respect. "This is what we fought for," Sarah said to Mrs. Thompson, who still joined her for coffee every week. Not just punishment for wrong actions, but a new way of doing things right. The elderly woman smiled, patting Sarah's hand. "You turned your pain into purpose, dear. That's how real change happens." Local businesses reported that the new security practices had actually improved their relationships with customers. Complaints were down, and community trust was up. What started as a response to discrimination had become a model for better business practices. As the sun set outside Morningstar, Sarah looked at the framed news article on the wall describing the case's resolution. Below it hung a simple sign that read, "Everyone welcome here. Everyone safe here." Sometimes, she mused to Lisa as she prepared to leave. The worst moments in our lives lead to the best changes in our world. The movement Sarah started continued to grow, spreading from city to city, changing how businesses thought about security, community, and inclusion. What happened that morning in a coffee shop had sparked a transformation that would impact generations to come. 1 year after the incident at Morningstar Coffee House, Sarah Bennett stood at a podium in front of City Hall, addressing a crowd gathered to commemorate the changes her case had inspired. "When I walked into that cafe a year ago," she began, her voice carrying across the plaza, "I was just one person facing injustice. Today, I stand here representing thousands who refuse to let discrimination go unchallenged." The changes over the past year had exceeded everyone's expectations. The Bennett standards had been adopted by security companies in 48 states. Over 2,000 security guards had completed the new training programs, and reported incidents of bias had dropped by 70%. Thomas Miller remained in prison, but even that story had an unexpected turn. He had written Sarah a lengthy letter of apology, asking to participate in anti-bias education programs for other guards. After careful consideration, Sarah agreed to let him contribute to the training videos from prison, turning his mistakes into learning opportunities for others. Elite Guard Services had transformed completely under new leadership. They now worked closely with civil rights organizations and have become an industry leader in inclusive security practices. Their CEO often cited the Bennett case as the wake-up call that saved their company. Morningstar Coffee House had become a tourist destination, with people traveling from across the country to visit the place where the movement began. Lisa Chen had opened 3 new locations, all following the same inclusive security model. "Look at what you've built," Mrs. Thompson said to Sarah after the ceremony, gesturing at the diverse crowd mingling peacefully under the watchful eyes of newly trained security personnel. "This is what justice looks like in action." Sarah's professional life had taken a new direction as well. She had accepted a position as executive director of the newly formed Institute for Security Reform, while maintaining her role at Parker and Associates. The institute provided training, conducted research, and helped businesses implement inclusive security practices. Jenny Chen's documentary had won several awards and was now used as a training tool in police academies and security companies nationwide. She had become a respected voice in discussions about media's role in social change. "The most powerful thing about your story," Jenny told Sarah during an interview for the anniversary special, "is that it shows how one person's stand for justice can transform an entire industry." The Bennett Act had inspired similar legislation in other states. Security guard training now included mandatory courses on cultural sensitivity, implicit bias, and community relations. The results were remarkable. Businesses reported better customer relationships, reduced incidents, and improved community trust. Angela Thompson Brooks had become a leading authority on security industry reform, consulting with companies and governments nationwide. "The Bennett case didn't just change laws," she often said. "It changed how we think about security itself." At Morningstar, Sarah's regular table now bore a small plaque, "Where Change Began." But more important than the plaque were the daily scenes of people of all backgrounds enjoying their coffee without fear or tension, protected by security guards who understood their role as community guardians rather than intimidators. The elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, still came for their morning coffee. They had become local celebrities in their own right, their story of standing up for justice inspiring others to speak out against discrimination. "Sometimes I wonder," Sarah confided to Lisa during a quiet moment, "what would have happened if I had just given in that day, if I had just opened my bag and walked away?" Lisa shook her head. "You did what needed to be done. You showed everyone that change is possible when we stand together." The Security Industry magazine had named Sarah their Person of the Year, featuring her on the cover with the headline, "The Woman Who Reformed an Industry." But for Sarah, the real victory was in the small, daily changes she saw around her. As the anniversary day drew to a close, Sarah took her usual seat by the window at Morningstar. The new security guard, Maya, gave her a respectful nod while continuing her rounds, embodying the perfect balance of vigilance and courtesy that the new training emphasized. "A year ago, I thought I had lost something in this place," Sarah reflected, watching the diverse crowd of customers enjoying their evening coffee. "Instead, I found a purpose. We all did." Outside, the sun set on a changed city, where coffee shops and businesses had become examples of how security and inclusivity could work together. Sarah Bennett's morning coffee run had indeed become something much more, a catalyst for lasting change that would benefit generations to come. The end.